This episode is scheduled to air just a few days after the 2024 US presidential election. If you're feeling pretty hopeless right now, you're far from alone. The future doesn't look that bright. For the climate, for trans people, women, immigrants and refugees, for Palestine and its surrounding regions, for the parts of the world that are right now most acutely feeling the climate crisis, well, it looks bad for pretty much anyone, except for the few that are hoarding more and more of the wealth. Obviously, even if the Democrats had won, we'd still be on the same cursed timeline, even if the ride might have been less bumpy. Our fossil-fueled capitalist economy has been on a collision course with the boundaries of our planet for a while now. And the call to anti-colonial, anti-capitalist climate activists is still the same as it's always been. We need a big change. Bigger than any presidential election. Bigger than any political party. That's why I make this podcast, and that's why you're listening. We all want to be a part of that change. But this dark chapter in history deserves its due. I've spoken before about the need to keep our optimism realistic. The latest science on our changing climate is legitimately terrifying, and we should be expecting things to get worse before they get better. My guest today addresses the topic of collapse awareness. This is a view within some climate activism and thought which accepts the inevitability of societal collapse on some level. We'll hear a bit about his forthcoming book, an anthology of global perspectives on collapse, as well as how collapse might fit within a solarpunk perspective. And I know this sounds pretty doomery for a solarpunk podcast, but I still felt a sense of optimism throughout this conversation. Collapse doesn't mean that there's nothing to be done. It doesn't mean we stop caring and lifting each other up. In fact, it kind of means the opposite. So stick around and I think you'll see what I mean. You're listening to Solarpunk Now. Join us, and let's imagine a brighter future together.
My name is Matthew Azuley, and my pronouns are he, him. I'm a YouTuber on a very small scale and a writer or developing writer, and currently editing a book, which is an amazing experience themed around the climate crisis, societal collapse, and revolutionary change.
So I brought you on today to talk about the book because I'm really excited and only a little bit biased because I'm going to get to write about solarpunk for the book. But I think it's a really great project that I wanted to share. And I was hoping we could start with just talking a little bit about what this book is. I understand it's an anthology that's collecting a lot of diverse perspectives, and it seems like sort of a mix of a scientific and humanities approach.
Yeah, I would say that's fair. It's developing all the time, like very organically, and really it's the authors who are really excited about contributing, who are kind of partly defining what the book is turning into. So yeah, there's a loose collection of themes of the climate crisis, revolutionary change, societal collapse, but within that, it's the people who are interested who are kind of slowly organically developing the more precise themes of the book. But yeah, in general, it's an anthology or a compendium, you could say, of perspectives from around the world, the US, Australia, the UK, Kenya, Nigeria, in contact with some people in China for potentially a chapter from there, also Brazil, and potentially some other yet to be confirmed countries in the global south, which is quite exciting. And yeah, it's going to have a semi-academic feel in some chapters. Other chapters will be very much more like the lived experiences of different communities and how the climate crisis is impacting them, and also how kind of neo-colonial powers are using the kind of global predicament as an excuse to further their land grabbing activities.
So it sounds like a lot of different scales and lenses at play here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think diversity, even though it's an overused and misused word, is really the key here, and that's what excites me most is bringing together such a diverse mix of people with different experiences from different classes, different backgrounds. Yeah, so it's going to be my job as an editor, and it's the first time I've done this, but this is the most exciting part of kind of um, working with the authors to tailor everything so that there is a kind of coherent thread through the whole amongst the diversity. So yeah, that's a big challenge, but I think it's going to go great.
That's exciting. It's cool to be in the role of an editor and be allowing all this, all the excitement from the authors and allowing them to kind of shape it, but also bringing it together into a compendium, as you said. So I want to back way up and talk about just sort of the journey that got you here in the first place. So I know you were involved in climate activism for many, many years before this, and I imagine that sort of your personal background with theory and activism and your own lived experience has shaped sort of where you've gotten to today. So I'd love to hear, I guess, sort of what your introduction was, what your wake up call was, that got you involved in climate activism, and what your journey at the outset started like.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess maybe slightly surprisingly, the, the the pathway I took into climate activism was through a personal mental health crisis. So in my early 20s, when I went to uni, everything kind of went pear-shaped. I had a
Mm.
mental breakdown, um, went back to the small town where I grew up, was completely aimless, and without any motivation or hope, kind of went through the mental health system. But during that time, I did do a lot of heavy reading about systems of oppression, particularly capitalism, and how capitalism as a system is implied in a lot of mental health diagnoses, or at least exacerbates them. And in terms of the power structures that capitalism relies upon, and how that makes people feel, and how people are forced to live their lives, and all the rest of it. And I also did some reading around the climate crisis as related to capitalism. It's somehow kind of linked in. And I also, around that time, or as I was recovering, it took me a few years, I came to really value being in nature, and that was really therapeutic for me. Um, and I realized that, yeah, all of the systems of oppression and all of the bad stuff that's going on in the world basically is kind of interlinked, and the systems that are oppressing the poorer classes, the systems that are oppressing non-cis male people, the systems that are destroying the planet are all kind of one and the same. So that was kind of my pathway into climate activism. Well, that's just the thinking, I guess. But then I actually met someone who I was together with for a while. My ex-partner now had a piece of land, and we tried to do the off-grid living thing, sustainability, growing vegetables, and all the rest of
Mm.
it.
Yeah.
Actually, we only got halfway there. We were kind of like it was a bit of a facade, because we were doing a lot of uh, going to friends' houses and watching Netflix and taking hot showers, and then telling everyone we were living off grid. So we never quite made it. But that was a kind of activism in a way, because we built this place. This is in the southwest of England without planning permission, so like without legal permission. Then a neighbour phoned the local authorities and,
Oh my
and told
goodness.
them what we were doing. Um, and then we went through this whole massive legal battle. and even made it into the Daily Mail, which is like the most right-wing paper
Oh, that's
in
horrifying.
the UK. And the title of the article in the Daily Mail was "Couple Builds Most Sustainable Home in Britain and They're going to be evicted." And it was absolute bullshit. It wasn't the most sustainable home by a long way. I mean, it wasn't
That's a
bad.
surprising amount of credit from the Daily Mail.
I know, it was crazy. I actually couldn't believe it. Really couldn't believe it. Um, I think they picked up the story from somewhere else. I don't know, but I mean, yeah, we use like recycled pallet wood and stuff for some of the building, but then some of it had like birch ply, which is one of the most unsustainable woods you can get, like probably implied in cutting down forest in Southeast Asia. So it wasn't the most sustainable home in Britain. But so yeah, so that was my first kind of brush with the authorities, as it were. Um, yeah, after that, I got involved with the Extinction Rebellion movement, which has become quite well known in Europe, but I know many people in America have never heard of it, which is quite amusing because when I speak to XR is the other name for extinction, the short name for Extinction Rebellion. When I speak to XR activists in the UK, they seem to think that everybody in the world knows about XR, that it's not necessarily the case.
Do you want to give just like a little primer about what it is and how you were involved?
Yeah. Extinction Rebellion was founded in 2018, and it's a movement of mass civil disobedience based on the theory of mass non-violent change, as proposed by the likes of Gene Sharp, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and the Serbian Otpor movement, which displaced Slobodan Milosevic, the authoritarian ruler. So it's this kind of theory of change which relies on huge numbers of people to take to the streets to perform peaceful, generally, acts of civil resistance, such as blocking roads, blocking infrastructure, um, and even going so far as filling the prisons um, so that the state can't cope anymore with the numbers of people breaking the law, and therefore forcing the government to make whatever changes that the people want. Obviously, in Martin Luther King's case, it was civil rights, equal rights for people of color. Um, for Gandhi, it was independence from Britain, in Indian independence. Um, so it's this model of change, but it's about the climate crisis. So it started in the UK, and it was to force the UK government. This was the idea, to act on the climate crisis with the urgency that it demands, and also the biodiversity crisis, but that didn't get quite so much airtime. And the three main demands of Extinction Rebellion: the first one was, or is, tell the truth, that the government should tell the truth about the severity of our ecological and climate predicament. The second demand was that the government should act now to get to zero carbon emissions by 2025. That was the initial demand. It seems ridiculous now. And then the third demand was to create a national citizens assembly, which would work on sortition, which I know your first guest, who was
Right.
also called
Who's
Matthew,
also Matthew.
yeah, talked about. Um, but this would be a slightly different kind of sortition of just one national assembly, which would work alongside the government and not even replace the government. So really, it was kind of halfway between moderate and radical demand, I would say. Um, but as it happened, the government did form a citizens' assembly, but it was very low key and didn't have any legally binding nature. So this kind of took the wind out of the sails of Extinction Rebellion, because to the general public, it looked like one of their demands had been met, but actually it was just a kind of um, a facade, like a kind of fake concession from the government.
Right.
But it's really interesting that they did that, because it shows that they were genuinely scared that Extinction Rebellion would grow into a serious threat. Um, because a couple of years after the founding, like in 2020, just before COVID, it did get to the point where we had thousands and thousands of people blocking the streets in the centre of London, and maybe a couple of thousand people being arrested and going into the jail cells. But it was never quite enough. After that, and then COVID happened, it decreased. The impact and the membership kind of decreased. I think it might have increased again now, but it's now become more kind of a less risk-taking movement, and there's kind of less mass civil disobedience at the moment. And it's kind of become a bit more like a mainstream NGO, I think, a bit more like Greenpeace now, which I think is a shame because that's not really what it was supposed to be. But I don't want to criticize too much because I think there are still good people trying to do good stuff within the movement, basically. But I did become disillusioned.
You were disillusioned around the time it started to become more of a risk averse NGO kind of model.
Well, I actually became disillusioned way before that. I became frustrated that it seemed to me there was a lack of strategic diversity in the movement. And there were these kind of strategy teams formed, which didn't seem to be very accountable or democratic. It was just like somebody decided that this strategy team was going to be formed, and certain people were going to be in it who had certain experience. And it became very much like the professional activists telling the others what to do. Um, but having said that, there was a lot of good, and still is, I think, a lot of good stuff that's done by the local Extinction Rebellion groups around the UK and also across Europe, and even Australia has some good groups. So I think looking at it holistically, there are still people in XR who do some great stuff on a local level. They do direct actions on a local level. They use the movement to socially connect. They even do a bit of prefigurative politics sometimes. They try out local assemblies as well as demanding the National Assembly. But in general, for me, it became too top down, and even a little bit culty, I have to say, sometimes, like people looking up to the founders like they're gurus a bit, which I didn't like. And there was also the issue of the potential racism of an arrest-based movement. So at the beginning, we were, the messaging in the UK was all about you're a hero if you get arrested and all of this stuff. And there was no thought given to how people of color would not want to get arrested because, like, the London Metropolitan Police are institutionally racist. That's been pretty much established. So that was an issue for me as well. And also, I think I came to realize after reading some anarchist material, such as Peter Galdalu's was a key one. I realized that the reading of history of XR was a bit selective, and their idea of non-violent change. I mean, I'm not saying that I would specifically advocate violence, but I'm just saying realistically, violence does happen, and it shouldn't be kind of always judged as like a morally wrong thing, and
Right.
the peaceful middle class civil resistance people are always the good ones, and the other ones are, doing things wrong or whatever.
We
Didn't
like a
express it.
palatable movement.
Yeah, and very Guardian friendly. We got in close with the Guardian editors, and they would always publish our stuff, and became quite safe in the end. Having said that, one of the founders of XR, Roger Hallam, he became frustrated with the tameness of XR, and he went on to found another group called Just Stop Oil. And as a result of planning a largely, well, I would say completely peaceful action, although a bit risky, which was blocking the M25, a big motorway around London. As a result of planning that, he's now in prison for 5 years in the UK. So and everybody's in the Extinction Rebellion movement is quite shocked by that. I actually spent some time with him before the launch of XR. Leading up to XR, there were some other actions by some of the same people. And I did a little action with him, which was vote no Heathrow, and it was about doing a hunger strike to persuade people in Parliament to vote against the expansion of Heathrow Airport. And it was really interesting spending some time with this guy and the other people I did it with. I only managed like 3 days without food, and then I gave up. But him and the others did like some of the others did like 10 or 11 days
Wow.
or more. Um, and this was like related to the guru issue that I was talking about. Like on a personal level, I really enjoyed spending time with Roger Hallam, and I thought he was like a nice guy on a personal level in a small group. But now he has become this big guru-like figure. Lots of people following him. I'm not saying he doesn't say some good stuff. He does, but I really detest this kind of movement where you've got a whole load of followers and a leader, because I think it's really a recipe for disaster. It's very brittle, for one.
Mm-hmm.
Like if the leader disappears, then the movement kind of disappears. Um, and also any kind of imperfections or biases in this one person, and we all have them, obviously, they're going to be reflected throughout the whole movement if they're unchallenged. So um, that's where that went. Um, so yeah, these days I consider myself a kind of ally of XR, but not I'm not interested in being directly involved. And I think these days I'm more, as you know, I'm more in line with social ecology, Murray Bookchin um, style, prefigurative politics, and stateless society. Even if it's not achievable, actually practicing that prefiguratively, I think is possibly more useful than demanding something of a government, which is potentially not a legitimate government in the first place. So I've kind of become more left wing and more radical now since my XR days.
How did that sort of develop for you? How did your thinking change?
Um, that's tricky actually. It's hard to pin down, but I think some of it was being inspired, as many people were, by the quite actually, to be honest, looking back, quite sort of sensationalist images of women fighters in the YPJ in
Mm.
Rojava, like seeing that in the media quite a lot, and then learning more, because it was such unusual images, and then learning about the Kurdish people in northern Syria and the revolutionary project there. Um, and then I read some of the writings of Abdullah Öcalan, who was the ideological leader of the Kurdish resistance movement, for those people who don't know. Um, and then through him, I discovered Murray Bookchin. He referenced Murray Bookchin. Um, for those who don't know, the revolutionary experiment in northern Syria is directly inspired by Murray Bookchin's ideas, at least partly. And then I found the Institute for Social Ecology online, which is inspired by Murray Bookchin and carries on his teachings and develops his teachings, because obviously there's room for improvement. And that's how I met yourself. And it's really through the ISE, like mainly, I would say. It was kind of Rojava in the media, and then hopped straight to the ISE, and then did loads of their courses. I was completely converted.
It's always interesting to hear people's stories of how they get to social ecology. So what does social ecology offer for you? What sort of problems does it solve, or questions you were sort of wrestling with?
Well, I think it's largely dealing with the problem of power, and how do we deal with corruption? How do we avoid gurus and cults, and how do we avoid the oppressive hierarchies of capitalism, which I've been learning about since my mental breakdown in my 20s. I never really kind of identified hierarchy itself as a problem, but I think in the background I was kind of unconsciously coming to that view maybe before I came to social ecology. But then when I kind of saw it in print, in the words of Bookchin, I kind of thought, oh yeah, hierarchy itself is a massive problem. And dialectical naturalism, which is kind of the core nature philosophy of Bookchin's, as you know, at the core of social ecology, and it's kind of quite simple, like deceptively simple statement that it's human domination over human, which has led to the illusion of domination over non-human nature, and kind of vice versa, I think, as well. This really seems to be such an important insight. And it seems so kind of obvious and simple, and yet the whole of civilization, modern civilization, seems to be divorced from this reality, like most of the time.
Right.
So for me, that's the core of it. And also the kind of anarchist elements that Bookchin incorporated, because he did identify as an anarchist for a long time. And since my experience with XR, I kind of was much more, I guess, pushed the other way by my experience into more anarchistic, autonomous organizing, like affinity group based organizing. And also what really appealed to me about social ecology was the kind of quite modern but realistic assessment of technology of Bookchin's, although I don't think he totally realistically understood what was going to happen. How could he, with kind of ecological overshoot and the kind of collapse that I think is happening to society now? I don't think he foresaw that, but he did have a kind of vaguely realistic or essentially realistic idea of how technology could be integrated with human society, and it wasn't kind of anti-technology in a naive way like some anarchists or anarcho-primitivists at least seem to be. So yeah, I guess those are some of the key things that attracted me to social ecology, and also that ISE itself kind of kept me really interested, because I think that the faculty is so amazing. Like I did courses with Chaya Heller, Peter Staudenmayer, Blair Taylor, Brian Tokar, Grace Gershuni. You know, they're all such great teachers, and they all have such a wealth of experience. And they don't all kind of follow Bookchin's words like dogma. They all have their own views on things, and I guess I think it's the faculty of the ISE more than anything that really got me deeper into it. Like especially Chaya's first course, introduction. I think she facilitates that one, the introduction to social ecology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was my intro too. I also really appreciate how diverse the opinions are within the institute. It's really
Mm.
not a dogmatic culty organization at all.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so before we sort of switch gears and get more into talking about collapse awareness and this concept of collapse, and sort of the framing of the anthology we're here to talk about today, I did want to give you a second if you want to talk about other projects you're working on right now. You mentioned being a YouTuber, so if you want to talk a little bit about your channel, where people can find you, what sort of content they can expect.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll just talk about it briefly. So the YouTube channel, I guess, is my main other project at the moment. It's called EpicTomorrows, and it was initially the side project of a blog. So I've got a blog of the same name. Started in 2017, the blog, and then the YouTube channel, I think a year later. Um, and it has been mainly interviews of various activists from around the world, and just kind of anyone I find interesting. So that the focus has been very loose, but it has become more focused over time. And now, as a headline on my channel, I've actually got written social ecological strategy versus metacrisis and collapse, which sounds very grand. And that's more like an aim rather than where I am right now. um, so, yeah, basically, what I'm finding is that I'm learning like lots of different things from activists all over the world and communities impacted by destructive corporations and all the rest of it, and oppressive governments. Um, and I'm not really directing the interviews too much. I'm just kind of asking people about their own experiences and kind of trusting that all of these different people's experiences will inform my own developing idea of the global predicament, in terms of climate and collapse, and how we need to get out of it, or how we could possibly get out of it, or strategize our way through it would be a better way to put it, because I don't think we can exactly get out of it. So basically, yeah, what I'm trying to say is I think that talking to as many different people as possible from as many different countries as possible is my way of trying to understand what's going on more, and to give also diverse people voices. And yeah, and I'm working towards hopefully developing some kind of strategy resources accessible to a wide variety of people, which would be informed by these different conversations I've had with people from around the world. But it's more still a vision at the moment rather than something I've actually achieved. But nevertheless, some people might find some of the conversations quite interesting. One of my favorites is with Violet Materu, who's an anti-colonial environmental consultant from Kenya. She's actually writing for the book as well. Another interesting one is Jason Bayless, who is the founder of aradicalguide.com, which is like a directory of anarchist and radical projects around the world. I would really recommend you visit his website as well. And he's also going to be facilitating a chapter in the book. And also a series I found really interesting after the military coup in Myanmar in February 21. I interviewed some citizens of Myanmar, not activists, just citizens impacted by the military coup who were against the military coup. So kind of like days after it happened, I started interviewing people. And that was fascinating. Hopefully I'll pick that up again. But yeah.
So I'm definitely seeing a continuity here between your YouTube channel and the book that you're editing. So I want to start with this word that I keep hearing, collapse. So I am not super well versed in collapse as a concept, collapse awareness, sort of this theoretical pinning, and I think maybe it may be less familiar to some solarpunk folks as well. So I'd love to hear your, I guess, definition of collapse, but sort of what it signifies, what it means to be aware of collapse.
So yeah, that's really interesting because there's kind of a collapse community online and on social media, and often, but not always, definitely not always, but often people who are collapse aware call themselves doomers. And I have a problem with that label. I don't call myself a doomer. I don't think it's very helpful. But within the idea of collapse, there are different definitions. Um, and I actually feel like some people within the so-called doomer community don't always understand like the nuance between different definitions of collapse. But the definition that I prefer, and I'm really sorry I can't remember who, it could have been Jared Diamond or it could have been Joseph Tainter. These are
You
two
can find
collapse
a
scholars.
citation later and put it in the show notes.
Oh, okay, that would be great. That would be perfect. So one of these scholars of collapse, who's written books on the subject, came up with a really good definition of collapse as not a single event, but as a process. And he defined it as a significant decrease in societal complexity over a significant area for a significant amount of time.
Hmm.
So significant is relative and subjective, but it does indicate at least decades. And it indicates in modern times, collapse awareness indicates that there is an awareness of certain trajectories within modern civilization that are, it is argued, irrevocably taking us to multiple breaking points, so that this will lead to a collapse of complexity, a collapse of more specifically global supply chains and infrastructures and energy systems and food systems, which will result in simplified living for large portions of the global population, possibly accepting the richest classes who might be able to insulate themselves for at least for longer than everyone else. So that's kind of what it means. And implied in that is a lot of suffering, obviously, because the sudden, or not even sudden, but even over the course of a decade, imagine certain global supply chains collapsing over the course of even a decade. That is still quite sudden.
Yeah.
There was one study performed by some academics at MIT that could also be in the show notes. That would be helpful, which concluded that the most likely time for a significant decrease in complexity or a significant acceleration of collapse would be around 2040. But it's not, I'm not really in the business of prophesizing, and I actually quite dislike these kind of YouTubers and people online who do these videos saying everything's going to collapse in 2026, the end is coming, and all this stuff, because obviously it's just like a bid for views. It's
Sounds like a
just like,
step away from the rapture's coming stuff.
yeah, well, sometimes it kind of overlaps with that kind of religious fundamentalism.
Right.
Uh, so
So I do want to
yeah,
ask about that.
yeah,
What makes collapse awareness distinct from either this sort of like, fanatical religious perspective, or the dystopias that are saturating our culture? Like, is it more, it sounds like there's an MIT study, so are you saying this is more scientifically based or more academic? I'm curious, how does
yeah,
this relate to the sort of doomer attitude of disengagement, or just like nothing ever happens, everything, like, what, there's nothing we can do?
yeah.
What makes this distinct?
Well, yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. It's definitely science based as I see it. Um, I mean, even going back to the transit, I don't know if you've heard of the transition movement, but this is something that started in the UK a couple of decades ago, and this was based on collapse, really, the idea of inevitable collapse, and how, according to the transition movement, which is a kind of secular, um, largely kind of apolitical movement of communities around the world. I guess you could say they do kind of mutual aid, mutual prepping in a way, but they also are still a bit capitalist focused in many cases, but on a smaller scale, like smaller businesses. But they're trying to prepare their towns and communities for what they see as an inevitable decline in carbon-based or fossil fuel-based, sorry, civilization, not just due to climate change, but also due to, I don't know if you've heard the term peak oil, the idea that we're running
Mm-hmm.
out of oil. I mean, that movement started a couple of decades back, or even 3 decades ago, and that's still going strong. So this kind of idea of collapse, science-based collapse awareness, is not new. It's just not. It's just never been very mainstream, and it is easy to confuse the kind of sensationalist kind of doomerism that you see online and on YouTube and so on. It's easy to confuse that with a more science-based collapse awareness. But for people who are interested in the science, all you need to do is look at, many kind of scholarly assessments of the IPCC, for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and how they're monumentally failing to prevent carbon emissions from rising, and how specifically the Working Group 3 subgroup of the IPCC, which is the group which has to recommend climate policy to governments, they are constrained by a capitalist bias. They have to recommend things which don't challenge infinite economic growth. They have to,
Right.
they're constrained.
GDP
And
friendly.
exactly. And so what is happening is that they are forced to come up with these net zero 2050 pathways, which are wholly unrealistic because they rely on carbon capture technologies which don't exist yet, or they only exist on a tiny scale. And to ramp them up to the scale we would need would imply a huge amount of mining and really bad land use, which, land which should be used for growing food or, more beneficial uses. So it's not just that, it's also the so-called green transition, which isn't actually happening because the global growth in energy demand currently outstrips the growth in renewables. There's also this geometallurgist called Simon Michaud. He's done a very careful assessment of what would be needed for the renewables transition for the whole global economy to be based on renewables. And his assessment is that we just haven't got the minerals on Earth to power civilization wholly by renewables. And it's more just a political claim that we can, pushing back against the fossil fuel giants. And I understand that. I totally understand that, because the fossil fuel giants have been responsible for a lot of evil. But the problem is you can't just suddenly shut down fossil fuels, because we need something to replace them. And at the moment, it seems to me, from what I've studied, that renewables are not totally viable unless we have a rapid degrowth, a massive degrowth of civilization. And what government is going to argue for rapid degrowth? I mean,
Right.
realistically. So
Everyone
this
wants
is
a one-to-one replacement renewables for existing
exactly,
infrastructure.
exactly. That's it. So, you know, unless there is a rapid degrowth of the global economy, from everything I've studied, and I'm definitely no expert, it just seems far, far more likely, almost certain, that we're on a collapse trajectory, because you cannot, it's the cliche, you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. And that is being expressed across every infrastructure and energy and food system that we use. So it's very, very, collapse awareness, as I see it, is very, very science-based. It's meticulously science-based. And it has to be. It has to be, because it's such a big claim. And it goes against people's normalcy bias of no, everything's okay, everything's always been like this, it's always going to be like this, everything will be fine, and we'll find a fix. And like, to push back against that, you need to have good science. You have to have good science. So for me, the science is convincing. I'm not completely read up on every element of what traditionally goes into science-based collapse awareness, but I think I know enough without understanding the economics even to see that that's the way we're headed. And I don't think it's pessimistic of me, and I don't think it's capitalist realism. Um, I think it's just realism. Um, and if you ask my family and my friends, they will tell you I'm one of the most optimistic people. Like, I'm always like putting a positive spin on things. So yeah, this isn't part of my character as it might be of some people, to say, oh, the world is terrible, it's all going to end in collapse. It's actually a kind of scientific assessment.
Hmm. So this is getting pretty dark for Solarpunk now, but I really appreciate that I think this is a really important perspective to reckon with, and the fact, as you say, that it is so based in evidence and trying to be as realistic as possible, like that cannot be discounted. And I've talked before about the difference between this sort of like naive optimism and an optimism based in reality. So I want to ask, like, what do we do when we're collapse aware? Is it just is it hopeless, or is there still a path towards praxis and action, and what sort of things would those be?
Yeah, no, I think that absolutely. Well, first of all, I think there is a role for solarpunk, absolutely, and many different kinds of visionary and political art, and envisioning, because I think that's part of being human. Like, human beings have always made inspiring art. Human beings have always created visions of what they want to see in the future, um, and that has always included political elements. I was thinking earlier about another example, which is, you could say, has some resonance with the current situation, and that is during World War II. The surrealist movement was quite active, and there were many surrealist painters and writers. and they were actively, some of them were actively also fighting against the Nazis, or doing some kind of activism, spreading theory which went against the Nazi propaganda, countering that. So you can imagine in the middle of World War II in Europe, it could have very well felt to some people like the world was going to end, that the civilization was collapsing. And yet, in the midst of that, you still had people creating amazing art. And okay, so maybe surrealism isn't so much about envisioning the future and creating visions of the future in the same way as solarpunk, but it still is about like another world. Like often it's kind of like the dream world, or it's inspired by the dream world. So there's definitely a resonance there. Um, and it's not just an escape. It's definitely not just an escape, because the surrealists, as I said, many of them were political and anti-Nazi, like anti-fascist, like strongly. So yeah, likewise in these times, I think we do need solarpunk and movements like solarpunk to, first you can accept collapse, or even just accept the climate crisis. You need to, without the whole collapse of civilization, just accept, if that's too much, just accept that the climate crisis is gonna still, even if we reduce emissions severely from this year going forward, there's still going to be bad impacts.
Yeah.
It's still going to be pretty bad for a lot of people. But even admitting that, there's still a role for these artistic movements to envision how can we see a way through the collapse to a to a brighter tomorrow, which might still involve a lot of suffering. Like imagine a total collapse where global food systems are broken down and we have to grow all of our own food again, and all of that. There could be a lot of hardship involved, but that can also be part of a revolutionary vision. So growing all of your own food to some people is a great thing, and part of a revolutionary vision. But then if it's collapse and not just revolution in inverted commas, it's maybe not just growing all your own food, it's growing all your own food and defending it against psychopaths, possibly, occasionally, at least. So yeah, I mean, definitely there will always be silver linings to most bad situations. And I think it could be the role of solarpunk and similar movements to envision the best version of collapse, basically, and not to be, and to be scientific about it, and not to fall prey to a complete fatalism where you don't see any positivity in anything, because that's not really going to help anyone deal with collapse. So yeah, I think solarpunk, even in the midst of collapse, yeah, definitely has a role. But I don't know how. I'm not that familiar with solarpunk materials, so I don't actually know what there is in the way of literature or art which kind of deals positively with collapse. But
I think it's definitely there. Yeah, some of my favorite solarpunk short stories or novels are sort of a community making the most out of a mid-collapse scenario, and what does it look like to, use mutual aid and local non-hierarchical organizing and power building and resource management, and sort of a local face-to-face scale, but still a political scale. I think that's some of my favorite solarpunk stories to read about, because it does seem to incorporate this collapse awareness. I think in some ways there are solarpunk stories that are already kind of operating from that. Okay, things are going to get worse. There will be suffering. So it's not so much a question of how to prevent that from happening, but rather our time and energy should be going towards how to, I guess, like cushion the blow, how to be prepared for the inevitable impacts, and have structures of mutual aid and care in place to help maintain social bonds throughout the collapse.
absolutely, absolutely. And I sensed that thread was there. And that's precisely why I invited you to contribute to the book.
That's what I'll be
And
talking about. Spoilers.
excellent, perfect, yeah. Um, and also, yeah, your chapter will be in the same section of the book as a chapter by an Australian activist platform called Just Collapse. Um, and their mission or their vision, you could say it's a kind of solar punk vision in a way, although they don't define themselves as solar punk. On their website, it states their vision is to ensure justice in the midst of collapse. So basically, to ensure that collapse happens in a way so that the most marginalized and vulnerable are treated fairly, and so that so that collapse itself happens in a just way, which is quite a big. You could say that's a very utopian, unrealistic vision, but at the same time, many people online call them doomers and like fate. So it's strange. Like it's kind of we're in this very strange space.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard to separate out the anxiety spirals gone unchecked and the hope spirals gone unchecked with, actually trying to chart a nuanced, realistic course forward. So I want to talk more about the book. I want to talk about, the basic stuff. What's it called? How's it organized? But also, how did we get here? What sort of led you to want to put this book together? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, great. Well, this kind of fell into my lap, this project. It happened kind of by chance in a way. I've been volunteering for this publishing charity, Arcbound, based in the UK, for a few years. I've been doing a bit of writing, mentoring, a little bit of amateur editing, um, and other stuff as part of my role as a trustee with the charity, which is a voluntary position. Um, but this chance to edit a book just came up a few months back. Um, the coordinator of Arcbound, Steve McNaught, he has recently become collapse aware himself and certainly very aware of the climate crisis. And he put it to me that I edit this book or have a go at it, which I'm really grateful for. I've never done anything like this before. But as for the themes of the book, it's also they've also aligned with my journey anyway, with the YouTube channel and my activism and social ecology and all the rest of it, and growing collapse awareness. That it's just kind of by chance that the coordinator, founder of Arcbound, also thinks in a similar way, not when it comes to the radical leftist politics so much, but certainly the collapse awareness and the understanding that we need really radical action to deal with what's going on now. So we had enough of an affinity that he agreed with me to take over this book. Originally, he was going to coordinate it, or perhaps someone else. And originally, the title was Revolutionary Climate Action. But I kind of had some emails with Steve and convinced him that this should be wider than climate.
Hmm.
It should be, it should include collapse, more of a collapse perspective. He kind of went with it. And then I just kind of went with the contacts that I already had, like partly through my YouTube and venture and through the ISE, other contacts that I had. And it's just been very, very organic. And I still don't know that much about the publishing industry. I'm just kind of making it up as I go along.
Well, it
Uh,
sounds like a good publisher. I'm really interested in this concept. So I worked in just regular publishing world, like for profit kind of things. So I sort of have a behind the scenes perspective, but it sounds like you do too, working specifically with a nonprofit publisher. So I'm curious, like what's different about that, what the advantages are, and also I want to talk about the funding model for this book, which is crowdfunding, which means all you guys listening, your perspective matters here. So I want to talk about maybe some of the the strengths or unique things that these models have allowed you to do that maybe other books are more limited in?
So the mission of Arcbound is to platform diverse and marginalized voices. So many of our books are by authors who might struggle to get published by more mainstream publishers.
Which have a
And
horrible diversity problem, by the way. I just want to say it's like so bad.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we have focused on like particular demographics. Um, I mean, we're very open, but for example, we have run a few schemes with people in prison, in UK prisons, giving them the opportunity to write and publishing their writings in compilations. Um, we've also had a few books now written by recent immigrants to the UK who have had difficult experiences as refugees coming to the UK. Um, we've had we've already produced a book, a multi-author book themed around climate, but that was more about climate adaptation. So that gives me faith that I can produce a multi-author book. It's not something that the publisher has no idea about, although the one I'm coordinating is a bit different. And what can I say? The reason we're using crowdfunding is just to help us survive, to be honest. So, like, especially since COVID, like the government, as many governments, has gone into huge debt. There's been a massive transfer of wealth from the government to corporations. There's been a transfer of wealth from the poorest people in society to the richest. And I don't know if you know about this, but in the UK, there are thousands of charities. It's a big part of our culture. Um, so, which is great, but unfortunately, that also means there's a competition for funding between the charities, and a lot of them don't survive. So rather than trying to compete for scarce government funds or funds from other foundations, one of our solutions has been to encourage all of our authors to do crowdfunding campaigns on a platform that we've set up ourselves called Crowdbound. So this is directly linked to the publisher, and we give some help with the crowdfunding, but essentially the authors do have to put in a lot of effort to raise their own funds. Obviously, there's a downside to that. It could be an unfair demand sometimes on the authors, but the upside is we get to publish more books, and we can publish for an affordable rate. Yeah, because we're a very small publisher. We don't make a huge amount of money from our publications, and any money we do make goes back either into publishing more books by underrepresented groups or authors from underrepresented groups, or it goes into things like writing workshops for prisoners, for homeless people. So we run some charitable things which need funding. Basically, the publishing enterprise is kind of a business which is under the umbrella of the charitable organization. That's kind of how it works. So it is a business, but it's subsumed under the charity. So yeah, crowdfunding is just survival, really. Maybe that's not what you wanted to hear, but
No, that's true. That's absolutely true. I
yeah,
mean, I'll say from my perspective, like, a lot of industries are very hard to break into, very elitist, very, the established big companies are always going to win out and outcompete the little companies. And if I, if you think about how unfair and unequal the world as a whole is, and I tell you the publishing industry is even worse, that really says something. And it's really true that there isn't as much room for independent outlets, for diverse authors. There's a really bad diversity problem. I cannot stress this enough in publishing, because established publishers want to publish things that are quote unquote marketable and have a quote unquote audience, and their idea of who an audience is so backwards and outdated. They just they assume their audience is like them, and these are already, people in established positions in their companies that have been there for decades and decades. So the
Yeah,
publishing industry is very slow to recognize new perspectives and to just allow them funding and resources in the first place. So I totally hear you, and I totally agree that crowdfunding is survival, especially for small left publications. We do not have an established, we don't have the huge media networks that are well funded that the
yeah,
mainstream and that the right wing do. It is like
right.
your money goes to paying people's rent. Your money goes
Yeah.
to covering the costs of getting these materials out there. It is really, it's really tough, and it's really immediate, and
Mm.
that's why we keep asking.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So, are there any pieces that you just want to that shout out that you're especially excited about, or
Yeah.
what are your big selling points here?
Well, so the book is structured maybe a bit counterintuitively for some people. It starts with a section on the kind of ecological predicament we're in. It then moves on to a section looking at different ideas for revolutionary change and communities who are responding in a radical or revolutionary way to the crisis. But then after that, which might be a bit counterintuitive, there's a section on the reality of collapse. So it's kind of to say, so it's not crisis, collapse, and then revolution. It's crisis, revolution, and then collapse. And it's kind of supposed to be quite sobering. And almost in a way, it's kind of a caution to activists to say, yes, it's great that you're pursuing these revolutionary projects, but they might not turn out quite the way you would envision, considering inevitable collapse. So it's kind of asking for people to marry their revolutionary ideas with a collapse awareness. Um, but yeah, there's a few chapters I'm excited about. I'm definitely excited about your chapter, the Solarpunk themed, looking at collapse responses in literature, right? And also marrying that with what is appropriate technology use. That's kind of the area you're looking at, isn't
Right.
it?
Yeah. There are a lot of
Um,
other cool Solarpunks in there too.
Yeah, there's also Max, Max and Solarpunk Surf Club. Yeah, they're doing a chapter, which will also be extremely interesting. As I said, Violet Materu, Kenyan um, anti-colonial environmental consultant. She's going to collect accounts from different um, communities in Kenya regarding the impact of colonial or neo-colonial NGOs like WWF and the Nature Conservancy, and how they're using the climate crisis and ecological crisis as an excuse to grab land, um, and how there's a transfer of power to these Western NGOs and then corporations through them, and ultimately Western governments. And that includes kind of like the evicting of indigenous people from their lands in various parts of Kenya under the kind of heading of carbon offsetting and conservation in inverted commas. So that will be a really introduced. That will be a really interesting account of maladaptation to the crisis, basically. Um, Also, Brian Tokar from the ISE is going to do a whole chapter on apocalypticism and utopianism in the climate movement. Um, he's kind of he's definitely got collapse awareness, but Brian's interesting because or so he told me, he's not totally sold on the total inevitability of collapse, but
Hmm.
he does seem to think it's a strong probability. So he's got an interesting kind of nuanced perspective. Um, and then another chapter, Just Collapse, I told you about. I'm excited about their chapter. And finally, one of the others I'm really excited about is I'm hoping to collect accounts from specifically women and LGBTQIA plus queer people, non-binary, from societies that have already undergone collapse and how that relates to the wider collapse. So it could be, Bangladesh, it could be Sri Lanka, Sudan, Myanmar, Haiti, any of these countries that have experienced extreme social breakdown. And what is it like specifically for women and queer folk, because these are folk who are most likely to experience the worst effects from any of these kind of chaotic situations. So yeah, I've got some contacts for that chapter, but not confirmed yet. But by the time this episode comes out, it's likely I will have most of that chapter confirmed. So that's, yeah, super exciting for me, that one.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm excited. So I just want to let everybody know where this fundraiser is happening. There will definitely be a link in the description. But if you want to talk about uh, sort of the goals and what those goals will accomplish for Arcbound, and different tiers, I know that there are some perks like getting a copy of the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, the target is £5,000, which sounds a lot, but that's actually quite on the low side to produce
Oh,
a
yeah.
book. Um, as we're recording this, we're kind of just over the halfway mark with a couple of weeks to go. But when this comes out, there'll just be a few days to go, and I'm sure there'll still be a few hundred to raise. So um, every chapter author is being paid, or most. So some friends have agreed to do it for free and so on because I've got so many chapters. But certainly the Global South authors are being paid £200 per chapter. My editor's fee was originally 800, but I've given half of that back to the fundraiser already, and I'm spending so many hours on this, and will be spending so many hours. It might end up being totally a voluntary project for me. Um, it's 1,200 or something, I think, on the publication costs, and then there's distribution costs and all the rest of it. So it really is a tight budget, and we're paying what we can for authors. And I honestly think it is a unique book. I did some market research, and there are some multi-author books themed around climate, but I honestly couldn't find any kind of globally diverse multi-author books which combine a climate focus with a deeper focus on societal collapse, or at least the potential for societal collapse. It might not be the most popular subject, that's probably why. But don't let that stop you funding the book. Yeah, so £10, just £10, or you can pay in dollars. I think that's about 15 US dollars. Gets you an e-copy of the book. So essentially, you're just pre-ordering the book if you donate $15, £10, or £20 for a physical copy of the book. Higher tiers get some extra perks. You can choose other books from Arcbound, of which there are many. And then the really high tiers, you get some writing mentoring from myself. I don't know if that's a good thing. No, it should be okay. I have got a bit of experience now. So yeah, I had this kind of sound bitey thing I wanted to say at the end, which was forget about COP29, which is set to be a joke, and invest your time and money in this book instead.
I love that. So we've talked a lot about collapse today. We've talked a lot about different visions of the future, everything from doomerism to surrealism. So I would love to hear, now zooming back to your personal perspective, what does utopia look like to you?
Okay, well, that's a really good question. I kind of have, I guess I kind of have two answers in my mind, and one of them, the more the more idealistic utopia, is kind of definitely a social ecological world, a stateless society, confederated, communalist communities, direct democracy, everything that was kind of developed from Bookchin's original vision of a moral economy, no money, no economy for profit, no financial activity for profit, no economic activity for profit. Essentially, everything held in common, deeply ecological technology. But the other answer I wanted to give, which is probably more realistic, but still really seems really unachievable, is that I would just like I think a real utopia would be that suddenly everybody wakes up one morning and is aware of what is wrong in the world and is aware of what the real problems are, and starts working towards solutions on those problems. So just for everyone to be aware of what the issues are without even having the society built yet would to me be a kind of utopia, like the mental utopia of where to start from. But it seems so far away.
That's really beautiful, though. Utopia is what we make of it. If we are utopians, then that's what we create.
Absolutely.
Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener. My guest today was Matthew Azuley, aka EpicTomorrows, on YouTube. You can visit the link in the description to order your copy of the book and help get this project off the ground. With just a few days left in the fundraiser at the time of this recording, your support really makes a difference. Speaking of, you can follow me on Twitter at SolarpunkCast, Mastodon at SolarpunkCast at Spore.social, or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes, and to support my show with a donation. And remember, the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with organizations whose goals align with the brighter future you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with collective practice. So keep dreaming big, and keep up the good work.